Thank you all so much for sticking to the end here. I think this is a really important opportunity for us all to share some closing thoughts and to tie together some of the things that we've been hearing today. And so I'm really looking forward to this discussion and grateful for the chance to help frame it. I'm Nathan Schneider. I'm a professor of media studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And I've been involved in especially cooperatives and other forms of shared ownership, exit to community, whatever names we put on it, in the digital economy in particular. This panel is called Building Policy and Financing Innovations for especially mainstreaming the ownership economy. One way I've started to think about the challenge we face is around the right to associate that's in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The idea that people should have the right to solve their problems, to create counterpower through association. And I think in many of our communities, we don't have that power. We're up against structures of concentrated wealth that can do things to us, and we can't build alternatives. We can't solve the problems that we know are in our communities and that we know we should be able to solve. And that's how I understand the stakes. And so when I think of what we're trying to do with an ownership economy, it's around enabling a powerful right to associate and making that a mainstream force in our economic lives, rather than something that is operating in, kind of as an alternative, as demonstration projects. So it's that ambition that I think brings us to this final discussion. We have a wonderful group to wrap up with. Julie Menter, first, Program Director of Transformative Financing Structures at Transform Finance. And then Raphaële Chappe, Director of Economic Research and co-founding partner at the Pre-Distribution Initiative. And then finally, Jason Wiener, founding partner and president at Jason Wiener PC, and a fellow resident of the Front Range in Colorado, and friend and colleague out there. So once again, we have a very a very strong Colorado representation on this panel. I want to begin by asking each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly in a minute or so. And I've already told you their titles, so I want each of them to say a bit about what you do with your days. What does that title actually mean on an average work day? Julie, do you want to start?
So Transfer Finance, glad to be here. Thank you, Nathan. We joked about doing the panel in French, but we'll spare you. But if I make up a word in French, that's where it comes from. So at Transfer Finance, we develop insights and strategies for the people connected to the financial ecosystem that are looking to essentially change it for the better, challenge the existing model and build the new. And my work focuses really on how do we get investors to think about the ownership layer of the businesses they're investing in as a layer of impact. Essentially, there's something, I used to be an investor, and to me it was like, well, obviously you use a safe or convertible note, not really thinking through necessarily actually who owns, who controls, who financially benefits from a business has huge impacts in terms of what it does with its time, with its money, who gets to make money off of it. So on a day-to-day basis, I think I have a desk job like many of us. I write emails and I'm on Zoom. And essentially I'm looking to gather insights from practitioners, from researchers, from thought leaders, and distill them for investors and for others to think about it. And then when I get tired, I go in my garden and pull out weeds, which is very meditative, highly recommend. It's an infinite practice, so it's great.
What kind of weeds?
Oxalis right now. Started to rain in California, so.
It's a pleasure to be here. Congrats to the organizers. It's been a really interesting day with such stimulating presentations, and I learned a lot today. So I'm very grateful. So at the pre-distribution initiative, we work with investors, institutional investors primarily, to try to help them improve their financial analysis tools and investment governance to better value society, workers, and nature. We have a number of work streams. One of them is focused on investors better understanding their own impacts on society and nature, and also how the transmission of those impacts into systemic risk, which then comes back to their portfolios. So these are relatively complex causal chains and causal links to disentangle. Once we have better understanding of systemic risk, we try to work with investors to help them with better investment governance and tools to better understand their own investment decision making. And then finally, we try to help them, guide them towards investment structures that we think are more regenerative and more innovative and share more with workers. What I spend my day is primarily looking at macroeconomic research and thinking about systemic risk, and trying to help investors understand how systemic risk impacts them in their portfolios. And I'm also on Zoom and on emails, but I don't have a garden. Yeah.
Jason?
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm sorry I can't be with you all in person. I'm dialing in from where it's still sunny here in Colorado. I'm Jason Wiener, and I spend my days both talking to policymakers, advocates, activists in the alternative ownership space, and also as a lawyer working in the trenches with clients that are pioneering alternative forms of ownership, alternative financing. In fact, I spent the last 6 hours today working on an innovative revenue-based financing instrument for a company looking at a alternative fundraising round. And so we work on these bespoke and model structures, and have worked in this space since 2010. I left New York City to work as the general counsel and a co-owner at an employee-owned cooperative. That was my formative exposure to alternative ownership and alternative finance, and then hung a shingle as a lawyer and built a team and an organization with a reputation for creative lawyering in this alternative space. I also spend my time working on employee ownership policy through the Colorado Employee Ownership Commission, where we're trying to build a hub and a global leader in state-run employee ownership policy and benefits. And I'm excited to be with you all today at the end of the day.
Thank you, Jason. And we also have Yev here, who is part of Jason's team, and if you want to network later on. Okay, so each of you, in those things you do during your day, involves interfacing with trying to solve capital access problems for people trying to build an ownership economy. I wonder if we could hear about some of the things that you're hearing when you're trying to draw capital allocators into this kind of movement. What are the places where doors open? What are the places where doors seem to close? And I ask this as a way of asking, what is the state of the field right now? So does anybody want to get us started on the panel? Anyone have something on the tip of their tongue, and then others can join in?
Sure, I can get us started. I think the main overwhelming thing that is what we're not hearing, maybe, is overwhelmingly folks just don't know that this is an investable opportunity, that you can actually invest. I do a lot of work around employee ownership. We also are doing some work around shared ownership of real estate, and by and large, people just don't even think that this is a thing. So that's kind of number one, I think, in state of the field. I think for the folks who are familiar, or who have some sense, there's a lot of perceived risk and complexity. So people get hung up on the acronyms, or they're like, oh, what's ESOPs again? Remind me the acronym. We're like, you know what, doesn't actually matter. Like, you're not actually going to be doing a transaction, you're just putting money into a fund. So that's kind of the next, like, how do we figure out really the story that makes it simple and clear? And then the other challenge is it's still an early field, right? So there's a lot of folks who are like, this sounds super interesting, but I'm not interested until it's a fund 4, or a fund that's at least, $500 million or $1 billion. So there's some practical challenges of it being early. But on the other side, I think the folks who are invested are really excited about the impact they're seeing, and the fact that there's something for kind of any type of asset, really. There's an investable opportunity for a range of returns, and a range of opportunities, so folks are excited about that.
So there's a sense that the risk-adjusted returns are not attractive. Also for large institutional investors, even if they were interested to invest because they may have intergenerational fiduciary duty, like a pension fund, the problem is that the benchmarks that they are held accountable to are basically based on the past 20 or 50 years. So the rates of returns are not pricing in externalities and are essentially too high, and so they're not able to invest. And so one of the things we're thinking about is how to reframe those benchmarks so that they account for human capital and social capital and nature.
Good. Jason, do you want to pitch in?
Yeah, we have both a traditional venture finance practice and an alternative one, and for the better part of 6 years leading up to about 2022, we saw a great deal of experimentation and capital flow into some of these alternative instruments and alternative company structures. Capital was cheap, funds were experimenting, LPs seemed like they were pretty lenient, and so fund managers were getting more interested and thinking a little bit more outside the box. And then, like a light switch, September Q4 of 2022, everything changed. And the door to capital completely closed, both for traditional venture capital and for these exotics, as I'll call them. And we've seen virtually not a cent flow outside of the seed commons and outside of the established co-op investment community, have not seen really any capital flows into these alternatives. And so we saw this kind of great exodus, if you will. All of our alternative legal structures jetted for the margin, either to restructure as traditional nonprofits to go the philanthropy route, or they are restructuring as Delaware C Corps to try to raise venture. And we spent the last year and a half kind of shepherding folks to those exit doors. I'm hopeful and seeing early signs that there's a return to creativity. But the biggest block I see is this push for scale and standardization. And so that means fund managers, lawyers, and the LPs are really unwilling to do anything outside of the traditional buckets that you see for venture finance. And so you've got, even to try to explain the logic of something alternative on a risk-adjusted basis, it falls on deaf ears. Folks are just not willing to do that much extra legwork. Like I said, I'm seeing some early signs. We've had some alternative funds set up in the last year, some alternative deals that give me some hope that that tide will turn again.
Okay, and that's where I want to turn next. Is that, each of you alluded to the kind of hope of a kind of new model, and we've gone through a lot of waves of new models. And Jason, while our kids are playing on the playground, we're always talking about how far can these models take us, right? How far can innovation within the system as we know it go? Are you seeing do you have the tools that you need? Do we know what the models are? in order to enable an ownership economy to be mainstream? Is the challenge a question, as you suggested, Julie, awareness, or is the challenge more creativity in developing the kinds of models that we need in order to account for risk?
I feel like I went first, so I don't want to do it every time.
We can. I'm all for flipping the order a little bit. Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in on this one. I might be biased, but I don't think there are policy obstacles in the kind of capital access realm. I don't know how deep y'all went into the limitations. Certainly, co-ops have access to capital challenges that policy changes could simplify and streamline. I think there are regulatory challenges, but by and large, I think we have a cultural normative challenge. I think that our focus in this hemisphere, this part of the hemisphere, is largely on multinational scale. It's not the SME scale that has incentivized the biodiversity of finance. So we tend to look at fund sizes that attract portfolios of a certain size. That is not true everywhere. And I got back from a short research trip to Emilia Romagna in Italy, where their funds are right-sized for the SME co-op market. And so they have a thriving capital scene. They don't need new innovations or creativity in terms. They've got it dialed in, and for 40 years, it's been growing steadily. They have other challenges. I think for us, we put a lot of emphasis on creativity and trying to reinvent things. And I think it's just reinventing things at a moment in time. But the emphasis really needs to be to break up the normative monopoly we have on thought and on however the power flows in the finance, whether it's on the LP side or the manager side. But I believe we have the tools we need, and I think it's really just a cultural challenge we face. And maybe the dire nature of our political environment will again kind of hasten some risk taking and breaking down some of those walls and some of that reticence. That's my hope. That's certainly what I believe we saw in the first administration, 2016 to 2020.
Yeah, we also need to think about how to deconsolidate capital flows to large funds. That's a real challenge because of economies of scale and risk aversion of risk asset owners and allocators.
What does that deconsolidation look like? What does that require?
Perhaps it requires the stakeholders getting an awareness of where their money is being invested and asking for different investment patterns. It requires longer horizons for investment and a recognition that investing in small and medium-sized entities has a role to play in reducing risk. It creates a more resilient economy. But again, that's for investors to rethink their benchmarks and their investment making tools to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, I think both of your points really resonate, both in terms of the culture of investment and more broadly the culture of this country. I was really struck in the panel this morning that the European founders being like, I don't need that much money, I have enough, versus I think the culture of the US being very different. And as a French person, I'm like, wow, this is so interesting. I think on the do we have the tools we need? It depends, I think, at what level you're looking at, right? There's the corporate structures and all of the alphabet soup of acronyms. I've been spending a lot of time looking at the funds, so the funds that invest in companies that can be employee-owned or owned in a shared way. And a lot of the existing models rely on seller financing, so the exiting owner essentially, having an IOU to the business they just sold and only getting a share of the value of the business at exit and having to be paid over, 5 or 10 years over time. And a lot of business owners just aren't willing to do that. You've built the business, you want to be done with it. And so there's right now, I think, really an explosion of models of funds that are trying to figure out, how do I replace, how do we structure it so that the seller has more money at close, so that these deals can be competitive with private equity, right? So it's just like a small fraction rather than 50% of the sale price. And there we're seeing, the mezz debt that are doing like ESOP transactions. We're seeing folks building in employee ownership and entrepreneurship through acquisition funds. We're seeing folks that are doing traditional PE but then exiting to ESOPs. We're seeing folks who are just doing holdcos that are employee owned that then do roll-ups. And some of those are partially EOT owned, some of those are co-ops. So there's all sorts of models, and there is no standardization. I think to your point, and that's kind of a challenge, right? To the point you're making, Jason, people are like, I just want where to, there's no equivalent of in VC where it's like, well, no one's goes and puts money in a VC fund. It's like, wait, what's your underlying term sheets, and what are, how is the compensation structure? And in this case, you have to, for each fund, you kind of have to do diligence on that in addition to, so it's just it's an exciting time, I think, in terms of the set of things, and it's difficult for asset allocators.
And speaking of culture, the banks are reluctant to provide senior loans because these deals just don't fit squarely in their due diligence process. So that's an obstacle.
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar? Also, Jason, I'm curious about how that resonates with your experience with the Colorado Employee Ownership Commission, working at the level of policymaking around supporting employee ownership in a context of a state where the governor is very eager to support employee ownership, and yet we still face challenges.
Yeah, that is consistent. Banks are both regulated and also very slow to move, so evolving their underwriting criteria is incredibly slow. But the SBA program that primarily lends to employee ownership conversions, co-ops, ESOPs, and others, is quite stringent, and the personal guarantee is a nagging, persistent challenge. We have a state program called the Cash Collateral Support Program that is intended to de-risk some of these transactions and help navigate around the guarantee requirement, and also help to de-risk for larger mezz debt investments. Still early days, so I think we're still working that problem, but I'm optimistic because we've got the right people coming together in the room to get to the heart of the matter. Unfortunately, the SBA program isn't something we can affect from the state directly, but there's some exciting federal policy that could help move that needle. Now, wherever there's a challenge like that, there's often a workaround, and so I'm also excited to see some of the kind of expansions of lending activity. Seed Commons has consortium actors that are active in Colorado. The Cash Collateral Support Program is beginning to underwrite and support deals. So I think we're starting to see some workarounds, and we are 5 years into the commission, and I think we're starting to see that progress pay off and starting to see the results, but it's slow.
Great. I mean, as we're talking about the new models, I'm also thinking about what you said earlier, Julia, while we were before this session. Some of the references to cooperatives suggesting that, these can never solve our problems at scale. And I'm just reminded that, in Colorado, for instance, we have 42 rural electric cooperatives that provide electricity and rural broadband at very large scale. And sometimes the tools we have are the old tools, or the tools we need, are sitting right there. We have a $130 billion cooperative bank, CoBank, in the tech center of Denver, and I always, when I feel discouraged, I think about what the farmers accomplished, in the 19-teens when they were pissed off at concentrated capital, and got together and formed and demonstrated that you can do shared ownership financing at scale. In some respects, the challenges we're facing are challenges that we faced before. I'm someone who, again, I like to look at the past in some respects, but also to the future. I need to visualize what we're heading toward. How do you think about what we're heading toward? What you're, when you're on your Zoom calls and doing your emails and whatever, what are you, and weeding your garden, what do you see yourself working toward? What kind of achievable world do you imagine this work leading to? Say 10 years from now. The time horizon of a venture fund.
Happy to go. So for me, I think about the macro issues a lot. One thing that worries me is the growing gap between firms in terms of high productivity firms and then the rest of firms, and also wage gap between highly skilled workers, well paid in high productive firms versus the rest of them. I think 2/3 of the increase in income inequality or earnings inequality since the late 70s is driven by this gap between firms. And if you look at that famous curve of like the growing gap between wages and productivity, it's the Economic Policy Institute, that starts to stagnate since the late 70s while productivity keeps going up. And there's some methodological debates around that, and the extent to which it's actually driven by this growing gap between firms and employees. But I think it still says something about what's going on, and that's very concerning. And it's also not just the wages being stagnant, but it's also the increase in volatility of earnings, and these things are quantified. There's like different ways in which you can measure that. Higher likelihood of large income changes. And so all of that gives you a picture of the workforce being precarious. And so my long-term vision is, how can we figure out a way to close that gap and to ensure that our economy is resilient, which this is why employee ownership as a general theme is so powerful. And obviously the name of our organization, the concept of pre-distribution, making the economy less reliant on solving problems after they occur, but being able to compensate workers for the risk that they take. I see high risk of technology change, skill obsolescence, and just business fluctuation being pushed onto workers. And so all of that indicates to me that there's systemic risk brewing, and so the vision is to try to reduce it. That's just a high-level macro goal.
Yeah. I feel really challenged by a 10-year question in these times that feel just incredibly chaotic and unpredictable. And I did a 10-year exercise thing in 2010 and then looked at it in 2020 and was very sad. So we didn't have the, net zero harmonious society that I had envisioned then. And I have to say, honestly, I'm actually in a place where I don't know that I'm going to see the change I want to see in my lifetime. And that's both deeply discouraging and also, maybe encourages me to how do I show up in a way where I'm just going to do this for my whole life, and then someone else will take it on. So, but I can see the next year, and I feel in terms of employee ownership, at least we just did a survey of all the funds out there with the Ownership Capital Lab and Alison Lingain, who was here, but was here earlier today. And collectively, those funds are looking to raise a little bit over $500 million. And for those transactions to work, they'll need about $1 billion in senior debt. So it's about $1.5 billion of money that I'm that money's out there. There's so much money in the world, and we know that money will result in huge increase in wealth for workers. And if we're able to, tell a consistent and clear narrative to investors, find the right set of investment vehicles, kind of move towards the necessary, the right kind of standardizations, I think we could do something really, really meaningful.
Yeah, what you said reminded me of something I encountered for the first time in Italy, as Jason was mentioning, which was worker co-op leaders saying, we're doing this for our descendants. I'd never heard that in the US, that sense that this is actually a multi-generational story. Jason?
I might be accused of being a little idealistic or utopian, but I'm going to borrow and credit a concept Nathan has written about, and Sarah Horowitz. I think the next 10 years we're going to see a flourishing of biodiverse experiments and examples that will help to shape a more recognizable mutualist commonwealth, a third sector. I think we are seeing the ebb of faith in our political democracy and certainly our political governance system. I think, for a long time we've been talking about, with no solutions at scale, to think about, economic equality. So I think this third sector is beginning to gain traction as a solution people can get behind, as imperfect as it is, as slow as it's been. I'm actually quite encouraged at the thought that I won't see the results I hope for in my lifetime. If that is true and these results end up being a century-long endeavor, to have played any part whatsoever in just helping to shepherd it, I think is powerful and certainly would mean that there's more traction and durability than if it is a single generation sprint. So I'm hoping we can look to the field, this organized chaos of examples to learn and draw from. The weeding in the garden, I think the garden's really a great analogy here. We plant lots of different things and hope something beautiful will bloom, or some combination of what we've planted will bloom. And that's certainly how I've conducted our practice. I think that's how our clients show up. And I've just been heartened at the insistence of our clients to push and where possible to not fall into any semblance of kind of a standard track. They are really devoted to certain core principles. And to be told that that's possible is really exciting to them, and it's heartening to me. It means that folks are really insistent upon creating, again, an experiment of their choosing. There's a real sovereignty and self-determination to that, and I think, if we don't have the results to show for it, I think at least we've really given voice to folks who are building something for themselves and their communities. And I think that inherent right to sovereignty, self-determination is a value unto itself. And so if we can look back and say, hey, there was this great move toward self-determination and it yielded, 10 years worth of these jobs and this wealth transfer, I think that's worth it.
Thank you. Do we have time for questions? I thought we had. Okay, great. Just a final thought on this question. I think there are some important lessons that we can learn from our past in doing this work. One is, historically, so much of the work around shared ownership has been siloed in solving a particular problem in a particular slice of the economy: rural electrification, agricultural cooperatives. I invite us to imagine our solutions in the particular places that we're working, to try to generalize them. The stock market doesn't care what industry you're in. Why should the financing mechanisms for shared ownership, for mutualism? What if we take, every time we try to make a change or make a model, make sure that it's a general one that others in other contexts with other challenges can use? I think that's an important lesson that we need to learn from the past. Also, to not just focus on the early stage where we are, but actually focus on what success looks like. What does it look like when we scale these models and build them out to the level of being some of the most powerful and important enterprises in the economy, and maybe work down from there. Again, this is how our dominant capital markets work. It's venture capital exists only for the exits that the success conditions that capital markets enable. And yet often we don't focus on those. And I think when we do those, we can build broader coalitions to create the kind of policy unlocks and the models we need. I'm going to turn it over to you all for closing thoughts. I think this is a kind of moment where we can have not just the questions for the panelists, but some brief, concise tweets that are on your minds. Or whatever the platform you're on. I'm on Mastodon these days anyway. So And you know, what has come up for you during this last conversation and over the course of the day? Got one there. I'll leave it to the microphone.
Hi, Arda Ungun, currently working at Stark Co-op. One tweet that comes to mind, and then there'll be a question right after it. I might want to push back on the idea. I'm new to the sector. I'm a greenhorn. I'm maybe not jaded and cynical yet, but I don't think any of this is something that we should settle for as being like a generational change that's going to not happen in our lifetime. Cooperativism and like mutualism, it's maybe not popular right now in our corner of the world, in our hemisphere. It's been going on for centuries. It's popular in places like Italy, Brazil, right? Kenya, like it exists out there. It's just not popular. So, and I think it's also a matter of, okay, how do we make it popular here? Frankly, courage to implement these ideas that we're coming up with today, right? And to put our money where our mouth is. So that being said, I'm excited that we're all in this room together to hopefully achieve that. Hopefully we can keep, the gusto that we want it to happen tomorrow. And if unfortunately we don't see it, that's reality. But I really think the answers are here. They're in history. Like folks 100 years ago have cracked the code. We just need to hopefully replicate and scale what's been done. Thank you for allowing me the space to say that. My question would be to, I guess, piggyback more actionably on this idea of how do we prevent the kind of centralization of capital in investment, right? Like there is a winner-takes-all structure to capital that makes it like easier and more efficient to invest. So how do we compete with that? Like this idea of right-sizing our funds, right, for the venture. It's like if we want to operate right-sized funds, but the capital is all flowing and being consolidated, at least here in our corner of the world, is it regulatory support? Is it like saying like, hey, no more funds about like $50 million? Like how do you actually achieve smaller funds to be successful when, they might always be outcompeted by bigger ones anyway that can take on more risk or blend, right, more of their investment vehicles and come out with better outcomes for the same goal?
Maybe could we hear a few more microblogs before we move to some final remarks from the panel? There's one in the front.
Who's our microblogger? Okay. No, I'm not a blogger. Just some observations about when you think about why we want an ownership economy, and now, is it an end goal or is it means to an end? And I would say it is a means to an end. Our end goal is to create a more just and equitable and fair society. And we have failed so far, as we look at the data and everything else that Martin showed. So I think there are multiple ways of doing that, right? There are two other elements that we probably didn't do very well in terms of delivering, in order to deliver a just society. One is the regulation, how we regulate our behavior, human behavior, farm behavior. Everybody needs to be regulated in certain ways. Somehow regulation has failed. Second element is how we tax. Taxation has also failed. So when you think about designing ownership, we have to think about what do we actually regulate better in terms of, there will be a trade-off, fundamental trade-off between, actually Martin mentioned that he doesn't like cooperatives because they're very inefficient, right? So it's a problem of, even if you have a different ownership structure, like sort of ownership economy, there might be as cost associated with the governance, like what kind of governance structure would have, and whether it would be fully incentivized in terms of getting the most productive outcome, most efficient outcome. So those trade-offs are there. But my question is that as we look at the economic structure evolving over time, what do we tax? So we tax capital, we tax labor, but we're not taxing intellectual property, where almost all the rents are going to intellectual property. Innovation needs to be taxed better, because if you look at right now, all the surpluses that we are seeing in this digital economy, it is the intellectual property. And we are treating intellectual property the same as other capital. And that's a fundamental problem, because think about Google when like Henry Ford started his auto plant, it was like a huge amount of capital requirement, huge amount of labor required. Now we can create $1 trillion company with very little capital, but it's almost all the rent is going to intellectual property or innovation, but we're not taxing intellectual property in a way that would give us more just and fair society. So I'm not saying that we don't need ownership economy, but this will not be the solution for all the problems that we have. Thank you.
Maybe one more, and we can.
This is really quick. In the U.S., do unions turning away from the Democrats create a political opportunity for the ownership economy, and what does the emergence of that look like?
All right. How much time do we have left? 5? Okay. That's probably enough time for a round here. Who wants to tackle something?
I'll tackle the one about the consolidation of capital flows and how to get smaller funds to thrive. It is a challenge. I think part of the solution could be to have asset owners and allocators understand that investing in large funds actually contributes to consolidation and has negative impacts. And so you have to have a way that these negative impacts are quantified and taken into account by asset owners and allocators. And so that could be, that ends up being potentially boring accounting rules to account for that.
A lot of these questions I have no answer for, so it is a good, it's good to what are the next things to answer? I guess maybe a couple thoughts that it prompts. One is kind of on the political opportunity of this moment. One of the things of employee ownership is it's a bipartisan issue, and it is something that has been supported by Republicans and Democrats historically, and so there's potentially opportunity, though, who knows what's even going to happen. This is where the chaos comes in. Will there even be an SBA to provide loan guarantee, to require personal guarantees?
Employee ownership was not mentioned in the Democratic or Republican Party platforms this year. It was in 2016 on both, but do you know where it was?
Project 2025. So yes. So what even is happening, right? So that is, but there. I think to me, it's this moment of things might not be quite as linear, and maybe that opens interesting moments of opportunity from a very tactical, near-term perspective. I think longer term, I really liked your point of why are we doing this for? The ownership in and of itself. Sure, but it is very much a vehicle, and I think this is where it's kind of balancing the tactical, where do we agree, we can make alliances with people we disagree with politically to get something done, and where do long-term actually we're not on the same page. And I think being super clear-eyed about that really matters, because there are folks who come to this work where they're what's great about the ownership economy is that everybody can be a capitalist and everybody can be baby Jeff Bezos, and we can all participate in the value of assets that passively gain value, right? It's everyone can have assets and stocks, and other folks are coming at this with the idea that we might privatize everything and manage it just makes no sense. Why would I privatize more and more of our world that has been held in commons? Why aren't we thinking about actually stewardship as a way that we relate to things and to the environment? And so actually the idea of ownership isn't necessarily now I own it, I control it, and I do with it what I want, but actually it is I am in relationship with this thing. I have, it has rights, we're in a relationship. So anyways, I think there's disagreements in terms of why we're, all of us in this for, and it's totally fine, right? There's definitely a number of things that we can agree on to get done near term. And I think it's important to be explicit that we're not necessarily all interested in ownership with those same perspectives, and that's makes it interesting.
Jason?
Well, with full recognition that my team is not in power in any house of federal government, the odds of this are highly unlikely. But I've been thinking for some time that our political economy for the last 105 years has been systematically constructed around shareholder value maximization. Every tentacle and every hair follicle of our governmental apparatus is built around this maxim. And I think everything we do to scratch at different interventions are attempts to sway and turn the tide. And I think they're largely inadequate when we look at what we're up against. I think what this moment requires is to take a step back and look at a canonization of equal rights afforded to broad-based ownership. Call it cooperatives, call it anything else, but a communitarian value set that systematically re-envisions our political economy. We could go deep into the tax code, deep into every regulatory structure we have in government, and identify how it has created and continues to favor shareholder value maximization over broad-based ownership. It's very clear. It's not as simple as just pure political lobbying, but I think this requires a full inventory of that asymmetry so that we can begin a broad-based effort to level the playing field. And I don't think that's just as simple as, change this rule here or get rid of the personal guarantee there. I do think it's a bit more of a holistic, everyone getting in a giant Noah's Ark boat together to re-envision the core values upon which our political economy is based. I mean, we've done it before. Call it a 29th Amendment, 28th being reserved for something long overdue. Call it a 29th Amendment. We need something that bold, that canonized, and we have to build, I think, from there deep into the details. That's my vision of where we go from here.
Thank you. In that spirit, I would venture to suggest that this is not just about means to ends. I'm totally on board for the IP proposal. As someone from the universities that produce all kinds of free information that then gets turned into private IP, but part of what brings me here is the end in the means. Is the fact that if we had a world in which people have a stake and a say in the institutions that affect their lives, that would allow us to be better humans, to be more fully ourselves, and to be able to solve our problems in ways that the people with power and wealth don't know how to solve our problems. So I think I think there's a deep value to the kind of pragmatism of keeping open the options, but at the same time, there is something, to me at least, about this conversation that is about more than just how are we going to deliver the goods, but something about the how mattering in some ways more than the goods. I think we're done. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to all who made this event possible. And thank you to all of you for sticking to the end.